am a member of the Theater Tech Club.
Right now, my focus is on acting.
One of the big things that I'm really interested in right now is leadership and bringing school spirit and everything like that.
I'm really interested in studying business at the moment.
I'm interested in cinema.
I'm really interested in the role of being a psychologist in the future.
I am interested in child development.
I'm really interested in playing football in college right now.
I'm interested in keeping my grade levels high.
I'm very interested in school, particularly math and science. The person who has made the difference in my life will have to be my mentor, Denise Stanford.
Kevin White is my mentor, I would say.
She's just made such a wonderful impact on my life here.
I've known her for 2 years, and she is a wonderful mentor.
He was a football coach. I met him over the summer when we first started workouts.
He's someone that I can always trust and talk to if I'm ever feeling like I need something, which is really nice to know that I have.
She's been there for me in a lot of occasions.
She's not only my best friend, but she's also like a hardcore mentor for me.
I met him for the first time before going on a Catholic youth pilgrimage to Lourdes in France. So it's just a lot of adventure I wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise.
Over those 4 years, we've become pretty good friends. We hang out in the off season in workouts and we talk, and he's kind of become a mentor and a somewhat father figure to me.
And he took me in, he mentored me, gave me a lot of advice, and he was basically like a big brother, and I was like his little brother. He took me under his wing, and I really look up to him.
If you have college essays you need to write, she will read over them and then read over other drafts and then final drafts. It's absolutely wonderful. I don't know how I would have done this process without her.
We've really been able to develop a relationship above and beyond our conversations about college, scholarships, and financial aid. We've enjoyed musical connections, academic connections, theater connections.
It's just we got along very well, so well that she stayed another year with me.
I think all of us go around in a bit of a bubble, and it gets us a little bit out of our bubble. I say to all my friends, come and be a mentor in the Computer Academy. It's a great experience. It's an upper.
I will tell another adult to be patient, to be kind, to open their hearts and listen to the problems of the students.
I'm really close to her.
She also helped me with the scholarships too, just making sure I was on top of things.
He was young once and he was a young boy, just like I was, so he had a lot of advice and a way to conduct myself and kind of teach me to be less of a troublemaker and more of an adult.
As an adult, and especially as an educator, it's always nice to be there for someone. And I think also as an educator, there's a lot of things going on in the modern society that young teenagers like Sophia need help with and just need someone to listen to.
Every time I have some problem that seems like the biggest thing in my entire life, and I'll talk to him, he'll look at me and be like, 5 to 7 days, we'll have this conversation again, and you let me know what's going on. And he's always right, always.
She helped me make my very first resume. We would do mock interviews.
He's really kind of fostered a sense of hard work and dedication to whatever it is I want to put myself into.
They are someone who is unbiased and usually very thoughtful about what you could do better.
You know, for me, meeting Laura has been a real privilege and a pleasure.
She helps me with, normal stuff like school, doing my math homework or writing papers and stuff. But she also helps me with emotional stuff and sort of when I need to connect with someone on a really deep level. She's my first go-to person.
So he kind of instilled in me, a discipline and hard work and a philosophy that has really helped me succeed.
I would suggest to other adults that they take, first of all, advantage of meeting young people this age and being with them, understanding their challenges and problems, staying connected with our public schools, and then having the pleasure of knowing a young person.
I think the more important thing that the mentor offers to a student is their friendship, and they have somebody who they can trust on, somebody who can listen to them and understand their problems.
If you make the initiative to go reach out and ask for help, there is help around. And with asking for help, you'll find incredible mentors like Miss Kleeman.
I really suggest just going out and saying to anyone that you feel that is someone that you can talk to if you really need to, and just ask them if it's okay if you guys talk. Tell them you're feeling stressed and anything like that, and they will listen. every time.
Break down that facade and just be your own self and be real to the student who's talking to you or to any teenager.
I think just making yourself available, like being very open and upfront about the fact that, like, you know, hey, if you need help with anything, like, I'm here, I got you. Because I think it sort of takes away that like scariness of trying to approach someone.
Adults have so much knowledge to give to young people, and they'll really have a hand in guiding their future. They can really shape that young person's life, who they become. It's a very positive effect on a young person.
It's good to go out there and ask for help.
I don't know of any mentoring type relationship where it isn't mutually beneficial.
I have done so many things I would have never been able to do otherwise, and I think it's a great experience for anyone.
What I would say to other adults to encourage them to step up to be mentors is just not to be afraid about it.
Yeah, I would encourage people to just take themselves up and do it.
There's nothing wrong with a relationship between two people of, you know, a vastly different age.
I want to become a mentor.
I very likely would love to be a mentor someday.
Do I think I will be a mentor one day? I sure hope I will be. If I could have half the impact on somebody else's life as he's had on mine, that would be a success.
I do hope to be someone who is feeling trouble can talk to if they need someone. That's something that I've loved being able to have, and I would really hope to be that for someone else in the future.
I do hope to be a mentor one day. I want to help kids, like I said, get into their problems, help them out, just like Lily has been doing.
I think just like, you know, seeing someone else like sort of achieve what they really want to do in life, like, and just like watching them sort of like get their stuff, you know, together, and like seeing them really grow as a person, and like I think being able to be a part of that would just be magical.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sione.
Thank you, Mr. White, for all that you've done.
I would like to thank you, my mentor, for her support.
Thank you.
Hug it out.
It's a pleasure to me.
Well, good evening, everybody. I think it's kind of hard to watch that film and not get a little teary. I've seen it 3 times and it still does that to me. So first of all, I want to say welcome, everybody, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Happy May Day. I am Charlene Margot, the director of the MA Parent Education Series, and it is a distinct pleasure to be here tonight. We have a very special evening planned for you, and I think that film really started things off right. I know that this is a very busy time of year for all of you, so again, thank you for coming out to this important presentation from Dr. Kent Pekel from the Search Institute. The video that you have just seen introduces our subject for tonight through the voices of our very own students, the importance of non-parental adults in a young person's life. If you were able to attend last fall's presentation here with Dr. Lisa Medoff from Stanford, who will actually be our moderator tonight, on teen stress, then you learned that the teen brain is growing and developing in important ways. A priority growth area right now is about seeking new experiences and new relationships. This is because our brains evolved when a parent's life expectancy was only about 30 years. To survive, a young person needed skills to create their own village with their own relationships and to take on new responsibilities without the guidance of a parent. Thankfully, our life expectancies have improved, but the need for teens to develop their own village remains, as you saw in the video. Tonight, Kent will share new and emerging understanding about the critical importance and the developmental need for caring adults. We are grateful, as always, to the MAPTA and the Sequoia Healthcare District, and tonight we have a very special thank you to the Esther Ting Foundation for making it possible for Kent to be with us tonight. He also hosted a workshop this morning for 30 professionals in our area from Menlo-Atherton and the Sequoia District, Palo Alto and beyond, so we are spreading the word, and the message was really well received. After Kent's presentation, coming up next, there will be a question and answer period with Kent, Dr. Lisa Medoff from Stanford, and Mr. Chris Rubin, who's the director of the Computer Academy here at MA, as some of his students you saw just featured in the wonderful video. Lisa is the education specialist at the Stanford School of Medicine and a lecturer in human biology, so she is very knowledgeable about adolescent brains and adolescent behaviors. Chris has deep experience in helping youth develop good relationships with adults. Please submit your questions on note cards for Lisa, who will be our moderator. There are actually note cards here at the end, and we'll be coming down to help distribute them and pick them up kind of towards the end of Kent's presentation. So if you have questions, keep them in your mind and we'll have a note card for you, okay? Kent Pekel is an educator and an administrator. He has worked at the school, district, state, federal, and university levels. At Search Institute, he is working on 2 innovative initiatives: the Developmental Relationships Framework, which you will hear about today, and the Perseverance Process, a study on developing motivation and persistence in youth that many parents here tonight will value, a future parent education topic, perhaps. Prior to joining Search Institute in 2012, Kent served as the founding executive director of the University of Minnesota's College Readiness Consortium and as the executive director of research and development in the St. Paul Public Schools. Kent also held several senior staff level positions in the Clinton administration. He has taught at the high school level in Minnesota and the college level in China. Kent holds a BA in East Asian Studies from Yale University, a master's in education from Harvard, and a doctorate in education from the University of Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming Kent Pekel.
Okay, let's see. If this technology is not failing me, and that technology is not failing me. Well, thank you very much for coming. It is a gorgeous evening out, and so your commitment or your foolishness is to be commended. I really appreciate it. We're going to spend a bit of time on a work in progress, which is our understanding of what we're conceptualizing as developmental relationships in kids' lives. We actually are conceptualizing developmental relationships as close connections between kids and adults in many different capacities, notably including parenting adults, as well as teachers, youth workers, and then mentors, and also between peers, because in many respects, those are the most powerful developmental relationships in young people's lives. While the framework I'm going to give you an overview of still very much applies to our peer work, as it happens, we have one of the country's most respected practitioners, thinkers, and researchers with us here tonight in the person of Dr. Barbara Varenhorst, who lives here in the area. So because she's here, I'm not going to say a word about peers because I don't want to actually have her stand up and say I don't know what I'm talking about. We're going to focus in particular on adult-youth relationships, but very much including parenting relationships. One of the things that I usually forget to do, so I put up a separate slide there, is if you want these slides, you just can't get enough charts and graphs, you can go to our website and they'll be posted by the end of the day tomorrow. That actually that is a real picture of how they used to do presentations at NASA from Look magazine. So even though PowerPoint it has become sort of a nuisance in a lot of our lives, it does serve its purpose in different ways. And I should just say, because I know our time is limited, I will be glad to stay for any penetrating questions or insights that you have. I just wanted an excuse to show that slide, actually. And have an opportunity to do that. I would guess that all of us who came to a presentation on this subject on a beautiful weeknight share a common conviction that this is at least partly true, and maybe deeply true, that every child is just one caring adult away from a success story. And in that statement is encapsulated a premise that we're hoping to test and ultimately prove through new research that we're doing at Search Institute, which is that caring relationships in kids' lives are not just what we would call in the research world correlational. They don't just go along with good things, but they're what we would call causal. That when relationships are created or deepened, they actually change a kid's life trajectory. That's the thing that everybody in education and youth development these days is reaching for. What can we do to actually meaningfully strengthen a young person's progress toward a successful contributing life as an adult? But we've got to be honest. That's not something that if you said, where's the data that you can prove that, I could give you in a very, very clean, simple way, though hopefully I'll make the case that we're close to it. Part of the reason I think most of us believe in that idea, that a relationship can change your life, is probably that we've experienced it. I was recently in Boston and saw this quote in one of their local Boston magazines, and I thought it captured that pretty effectively. The writer said, "Nearly every person I know has some version of this story, the moment when a teacher changes the course of your life. A good teacher, after all, wields the authority of a parent with none of the psychological baggage. The best of them are semi-mysterious figures whose wisdom seems boundless and whose approval helps us discover who we are." Pretty nice three-sentence description of what we mean by a developmental relationship. If we had more time tonight, I would do what we did this morning, which is ask each of you to think a bit and then share a story of somebody who was a developmental relationship in your life, who meaningfully helped you discover who you were and put you on a different path to the future. But because we're in a big auditorium and it's dark and we have limited time, I'm just going to give you a really quick glimpse of a relationship that was developmental for me in my growing up, which was largely in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area of Minnesota. As a way to ease in to the subject before we start talking a bit about research. So there was a woman who went by a name you don't hear very often anymore, Drusilla Nelson, and she was in her 90s when I got to know her really well, and she had latched onto our family. My grandfather was a minister, and she had gone to one of his churches and was never married. She was a middle school English teacher and had just become, even though not a blood relative, part of our family. And the thing about Drew, in retrospect, that was developmental for me was this was a woman who lived in a tiny apartment in a neighborhood in Minneapolis that when she started living there was all Norwegian Lutherans like her, that by the time I was going to visit her there was diverse and urban and dramatically changed. And she never left the house without looking immaculate. She never treated anybody like they weren't her closest friend. And more than that, she, just by osmosis, by daily interaction, gave me the sense that basically you always had to bring your A game. You always had to approach life with a sense of optimism. And in thinking about this presentation tonight, I pulled out a letter that she wrote for me at a moment that was a pretty difficult one for me as a young adult. I had been teaching high school, and in the summers, I took American high school kids to China to learn Chinese and have a youth development experience. And the second summer I did it, the university that was supposed to host these 25 Americans that I was about to take over to China called and canceled the housing arrangements 2 weeks before we were supposed to go. So suddenly I had 25 Americans and I had to find some place to put them in the middle of Shanghai, and had no real idea how I was going to handle it. And Drew, who then was 93, wrote me this letter. I'm not going to read you very much of it, but you can see how in a simple piece of interaction, she was sort of imprinting on my brain an outlook that I hope I've managed to keep alive to this day. She said, "It's not bad at all being 93. I'm trying it on for size this morning and liking it as long as I can share your interests vicariously. It's no secret that I'm proud of your accomplishments, but equally enthusiastic about what's ahead. I am not unmindful of the responsibility you're going to have this summer, especially given the crisis you've inherited. But if the people who are behind the project have enough confidence in your ability, I believe you will make it successful. Nothing worthwhile was ever achieved without work and dedication to the cause. Keep your wagon hitched to a star. You will do well. Never let disappointment become discouragement. I'm looking forward to our next lunch. I like tomorrow's. Love, Drew." So this was a 93-year-old woman who 20 years later, I'm still taking a certain sense of uplift from. And if you told me that that was the case at the time, I don't think I would have realized it was working on my psyche that way. So relationships have that kind of power, and I'm sure every one of you would have some kind of an example of that in your life. And yet, we see there are big gaps in kids' experience of these relationships. At Search Institute in 2010, we did a very large study of adolescents in grades 6 through 12, and we basically asked them about the support we would call them assets in their lives. And you can see that, interestingly, the significant majority of them felt pretty supported in their families. But when we framed the question a bit more specifically and we said, what about positive family communication? We only had 32% saying that they experienced that. When we asked about positive adults beyond their family, half the kids said they had it, half the kids said they didn't. You can see when we asked about relationships in their neighborhood, we had 40% say they had caring relationships there, 35% saying they had caring school climates. And then for those of us who are educators, a very disturbing only 33% who said their parents were positively engaged with them in a relationship in schooling. So there are some pretty big gaps in kids' experience of the kind of relationships that matter in their lives. So the question then is, why does this stuff matter so much? In some ways, the idea that relationships matter is a blinding flash of the obvious, but what we're finding increasingly through the research is that they matter in ways that that have a lot to do with the kind of outcomes we're increasingly interested in. Kids' capacity to persevere, kids' optimism for the future, kids' success in school. And if you think of it as a cog in a machine, if that relationship cog is not moving, all the opportunities you provide for kids and all of the other things that may be happening inside their brains and developmentally are likely to struggle. It's almost like this is actually a real product, bacon toothpaste. So the reason I chose this example is not because I want to encourage you to choose bacon toothpaste, but in bacon toothpaste there is no fluoride. Fluoride is the active ingredient in toothpaste. And if you use a toothpaste that has no fluoride, or if you try and bake bread with no yeast, you're missing the active ingredient and you're very unlikely to achieve the outcomes that you're seeking when you use the product. Two researchers at Pittsburgh recently made the comparison between the active ingredient in a product like toothpaste and relationships in youth development. They're the active ingredient. My predecessor at Search Institute, Peter Benson, said relationships are the oxygen of human development. So the importance of these things in kids' lives really can't be overstated. I'm now going to very quickly give you examples from quite important, rigorous research from different fields, all of which underscores the centrality of relationships for kids' success. This is a study that we've got ongoing. It's a large data set with a large urban population in the southwest of the United States. I can say it here, it's Dallas. In the paper, we won't name it. Here's what we're finding. We're finding very high correlations between the relationships, kids who have close relationships in their lives, and these outcomes. How motivated they are, how self-confident they are, how frequently they practice good study habits, their grades, and even their PSAT scores later on in school. Another study that we did took a look at the American family, and what we found was that the quality of the relationships within a family was a far better predictor of how well the kids were doing in school and how much risk they were participating in. Were they using drugs? Were they using alcohol? Than any other factor. And that was true across all demographic groups, across people who were low income, across wealthy people, and across all racial and income groups. James Heckman is an economist at the University of Chicago who won a Nobel Prize. He's really the rock star whose research gave birth to the new investments that are happening in early childhood. And he wrote a paper on effective interventions for struggling students who struggle in school. And here's what his conclusion was. The common feature of successful interventions across all stages of the life cycle through adulthood is that they promote attachment and provide a secure base for exploration and learning for the child. Successful interventions emulate the mentoring environments offered by successful families. This is from a quantitative economist who's all about the numbers and who's saying the single most important thing in an effective school or program for kids is attachment and nurture. The two researchers from the University in Pittsburgh went so far as to say the effectiveness of child-serving programs, practices, and policies is determined first and foremost by whether they strengthen or weaken developmental relationships. Two researchers, one of whom many of you probably know, Carol Dweck, and some colleagues at Stanford, concluded that the perception that teachers care about their students is among the best predictors of student performance. So these things matter tremendously within school. Two colleagues at Harvard concluded that relationships are the soil in which young people's social and emotional learning skills grow. Two doctors, one at Yale and one at Mount Sinai, concluded that support from others is foundational to self-confidence. That in fact, when you are backed by others in your support network. It increases your self-confidence, provides a safety net if we should fall, and bolsters our belief that we can overcome obstacles. And as a result, we tend to more actively solve problems rather than passively avoiding challenges. And finally, many of us have been concerned about some trends that are happening with boys, which manifests itself in everything from risk behaviors to dropping out of school to much lower enrollment in and success in college. Two researchers who looked at this issue said, counter to cultural assumptions that boys are generally resistant to schooling, boys in our studies indicated remarkable acceptance of the value and necessity of their school programs. Resistance and opposition arise most commonly when boys are unable to establish positive relationships with teachers and other staff. So 8 different examples, all of which from the research point to the importance of relationships. And the reason that I'm thrilled that you're here tonight and that I'm glad I'm here. As I mentioned, at Search Institute, our premise is that this is more than correlation. Now, by correlation, we would mean that if an alien came to Earth and noticed that every time there's a fire, these men with helmets show up and jackets, and so therefore one could conclude that firefighters cause fire, that would be an inappropriate assumption of cause. The two correlate, but they're not causal. Our premise here is that the right relationships are causal in a positive sense. And that's something that we're hoping to explore in the years ahead. So if everything I've said, my personal little story about Drew, those 8 different studies, makes sense, we're nonetheless faced with a problem, which is that especially for people who are working directly with kids, as parents, as educators, as counselors, how do you do this stuff? What's inside the black box? How do you build the kinds of relationships with young people that put them on a path to thriving in school and in life? So that's what we've been focused on for the last year and a half at Search Institute. And I won't go in detail into how we've come up with the framework that we're going to talk about now, but it's been part qualitative, out talking to kids, educators, youth workers, parents, and part quantitative, looking at the data that we have at Search Institute and elsewhere to understand the connections in kids' lives and what they might tell us about what matters in their relationships. An example of the kind of data sets that we looked at to come up with the framework that we're going to spend the rest of our time on is this one. We did a large national study of 15-year-olds, representative sample and oversampled for low-income groups, students of color, groups that sometimes are harder to capture in surveys. And we asked the simple question, when an adult gets you, what do they do? And I think we found some pretty interesting things there. We first of all, maybe not surprisingly, found that they listen to me. The question I would pose to not just you, but to myself then is, okay, how often do we really do that with kids? They're honest with them. And then you can see as the percentages cascade down a bit, it's not until we get to 39% that we get something like gives me privileges. This was an item in a long survey that's been validated in other items, and so I think we probably shouldn't dismiss that as just the kids sort of saying what they think what we want to hear. That even though kids might accept those privileges happily, they often are aware that it's not necessarily what they need to become their best selves. In the future at Search Institute, we're going to be building this out in what we hope are some pretty practical, useful ways. Our first major study of developmental relationships of the framework we're going to talk about in a moment will come out in the fall, so you're getting one of the first previews of this framework. Actually, now that I think about it, today you're getting the first preview of what this framework looks like. There will be a survey that helps us measure kids' experience of developmental relationships. We're redesigning a website that we have for parents called parentfurther.com that will be live in the fall with resources to understand this. And then most importantly, over time, we want to be able to provide people with practical ways to do this stuff. We want to go beyond being able to take you to the museum, metaphorically, and show you the painting and tell you why it's beautiful, but be unable to tell you how to paint it. We want to be able to help people build these relationships in kids' lives in practical terms. There's a big need for practical tools to do this stuff because if you simply show up to kids and say, hey, I want to build a developmental relationship with you, your chances of success are probably pretty low. Okay, So here's how we're defining developmental relationships. Developmental relationships are close connections that powerfully and positively shape young people's identities and help them develop thriving mindsets. As I mentioned at the outset, we think these things happen between adults and kids and between kids and kids. So really there's two core outcomes of what we're calling a developmental relationship. One is a positive sense of self, of identity, and two, a thriving mindset. Let me just say a bit about each of those before we jump in to the framework we'll be talking about. So I thought I'd pick a study. It's with younger kids than the teenagers we're mostly focusing on today, but I think it illustrates pretty powerfully how relationships are one of the primary ways that kids' identities are shaped, the sense of who I am. It was two researchers who decided to contrast generosity in kids' lives, and they did it with young kids. The kids were 7 and 8 years old. And there was a game that the kids played with marbles, and at the conclusion of the game, they were given the strong suggestion and opportunity, but not mandate, that they give some marbles to kids who don't have any marbles. They essentially took marbles away from their pile. But here's what the experiment tested. After one group gave away some of the marbles, they were praised with this language. It was good that you gave some of your marbles to those poor children. That was a nice and helpful thing to do. So they were praised for the action that they took. The second condition was, I guess you're the kind of person who likes to help others whenever you can. You are a very helpful and nice person. So they were actually, the action was attributed to their generous character. 2 weeks later, they brought the same kids back, had them play the same game again, and what was very interesting was that the kids in the second group, who were praised for their character, were much more generous the second time around than the kids in the first group. Now, there's no simple conclusion as to why that happened, but the supposition of the researchers and others who looked at that is that that was an act of identity formation. That was an adult attributing a positive character to the young person, which had greater sticking power than a comment that simply said, you did the right thing at that moment. So it's evidence like this that's brought us to the assumption that relationships are really powerful ways for shaping kids' characters. The second piece of a thriving mindset is really, it's a new term that we're using, which attempts to encapsulate the fact that when a kid develops that commitment, not just to get by in life, but to flourish, and not just to survive, but to thrive, they've crossed a very important point in their development. There's an internal commitment to be all that they can be, to use the old phrase that the Army would have used. And there's actually a quote from a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote to a young law student in 1855, which I think captures really nicely in a single sentence what we're meaning by a thriving mindset. Your own resolution to succeed is more important than any other one thing. Now, Lincoln wasn't telling that law student that a lot of other stuff didn't matter tremendously, and that especially if you added all those things up, it couldn't get in your way and stop your progress through life or propel you forward, but that more important than any other one thing was the resolution to succeed. When we did the research that led to the early research that led to the developmental relationships framework that I'm going to talk about here, and we pushed kids who talked about these transformative relationships in their lives, it was these two things that underlay their answers. One, this relationship helped me decide who I am in a positive sense, and two, this relationship helped me commit to always strive to be my best. Now, obviously, we're oversimplifying lots of different ways that played out in these kids' lives, but that's the end toward which developmental relationships develop kids in our early thinking. So, what kind of actions make a relationship developmental in the sense that we're describing it now? You have a one-pager that's actually so new there's still a typo in it, but we came out with 5 big macro concepts that ran across this analysis that we did over the last year and a half. And believe me, we tried pretty hard to get it to the smallest number we could. And so this list was a lot longer at the outset. And by the time we take this research to the conclusion of our first study, it may be shorter still. We're trying to make this as simple and as concise as possible. So here's what we found. Expressing care, giving support, challenging growth, expanding possibilities, and sharing power. That those 5 actions, when happening within a relationship in a pretty organic and fluid way, add up to a younger person's developing that thriving mindset and that positive sense of identity. Now, none of these things happen in isolation. There's a dynamic interplay between all of them, and 2 that are obviously very easy to see the connections between are challenge and support. That in these relationships, the kid is pushed to go beyond the status quo. That the way things are is never entirely satisfactory, but just as important, support is given as challenge is increased. And so in a perfect world, you get sort of a trajectory that looks like that. A lot of times in our schools, I would say especially, and I say that as an educator, we do a lot more of one than the other. We challenge them to death on expectations on steroids without giving very much support, or we love them to death without giving them adequate challenge. Whereas what we know developmentally and educationally, it's when you get right in that sweet spot where challenge and support are balanced that you start to get some really exciting outcomes. The 5 components that are in the developmental relationships framework are in some ways really best captured in that amazing moment when an infant takes their first steps. And so let me just give you a really quick sense of that. First of all, expressing care. If anybody has ever gotten a baby or an infant to walk without a smiley face and a positive voice and eye contact and a lot of body language encouraging that kid to move, I'd be pretty shocked. That it's pretty fundamental in that really, that magical moment when an infant takes their first steps is that obvious expression of caring. Second, when that kid is taking their first steps, it's challenging growth like almost will never happen again in that individual's life. Their little brain literally has never controlled their legs in that way before. And there is every reason for them to be scared that they're going to fall down, which of course they probably will. And so they're challenging growth in a very real sense as well. But at the same time, they're providing support. In fact, they literally are saying, I'm here to catch you when you fall. And the hands are outstretched. In terms of sharing power, which we're going to talk about this in a minute, we really mean that the young person's autonomy, their agency, their decision-making, their desires is seen and acknowledged. When have you ever heard somebody say, well, I decided my son or daughter was going to walk at X months, and then they just did it? You can't control that. When the kid is going to walk, the kid is going to walk. You can encourage it, you can create conditions for it, but ultimately it's going to happen developmentally when the kid is ready to walk. And so the act of an infant learning to walk is a really great example of sharing power in a sense. And then finally, expanding possibility, especially for all of us who've had little kids who then were able to walk around the house and literally their view of the world got a couple feet higher. That's a dramatic expansion of possibility. They're no longer actually completely dependent upon grown-ups to take them from one room to the next. So, when you put those 5 pieces together, here's what it looks like. And what I'd like to do is just walk through the framework and give you one example of each of these 5 as an early illustration of what we mean by the framework. And then what I'll do is conclude with a quick sense of how these 5 actually might fit together in a kid's life and how you might think about your own son or daughter or the young people you work with in your school or program experience these 5 actions. So the first is expressing care. And as some of the folks earlier today talked about, really this is the foundation. The old saying that people don't care what you know until they know that you care is a really fundamental beginning premise of building a developmental relationship. And the core idea that undergirds what we're thinking of with expressing care is show that you like me and you want the best for me. Really critical there is expressing care, that the young person is explicitly aware that the care is coming from the peer or from the adult. And there's 5 what you might call sub-actions under that framework: being present, being warm, investing, showing that you're actually willing to give of your time, of your resources to the relationship, showing interest in what the young person is doing, and very critically, we heard a lot about this from the young people we interviewed, being dependable. That young people's antenna is out for adults who say they're going to do things and that when they don't follow through. And they interpret caring as people who I can depend upon. So one example that came from the work we did of emotional caring, and this actually was some work that I participated in directly. We were in a large high school, happened to be in a mid-sized city, and we basically posed the question, who are your master relationship builders in this high school? Who's really good at doing this with kids? And one of the people they pointed us toward was the work experience coordinator, the person who coordinated the work programs for kids. And so I went and I interviewed her, and I said, why are you so good at building these relationships? And how do you express care? And she said something that actually was a technique that I actually went home and did with my own kids subsequent to that. She said, the first thing I do when a kid enters my caseload is I make enough time to talk with them to get some sense of what makes them tick. So, and this is in a large high school, so finding time is not a simple thing. Said it's got to be at least a half an hour. I get a half an hour, I find out what makes them tick. Then at the end of the conversation, I immediately write it down, because I know I'm probably going to forget it, because life's going to happen and life's going to go on. And then at the same time, I actually look at the calendar and I plan when I'm going to touch base with them. That's why this picture. Touch base with the kid on the issue that they're dealing with. So it could be something that is a serious issue, it could be something that they love, it could be positive, it could be negative. And then what she said was, I find a time when they're not expecting it, and I slow the kid down, and I tell them that I was thinking about the issue that they shared with me at some point when I wasn't in the school or with them or on the job. I tell them that I was thinking about them when I was driving to work, when I was at home on the weekend with my kids, when I was watching a basketball game. And what she said was, if I do that and it's authentic, what I've just said to the kid was, I'm tracking, I see you, I'm tracking what you're saying, and I'm thinking about you when I'm not on the clock. I'm concerned about you when you're not in front of me. And I'm connecting the dots between one conversation and the next one. And I'll never forget what she said to me when that issue came up. She said, and when I do that and it works, I've got them and they're mine, in a good sense. So she's one of these people who approached building relationships with kids with an intentionality and frankly a precision that almost made it seem a little mechanical, but not in a bad sense. She said, I have to organize this stuff in these kids' lives. So the notion that you're going to make a conscious effort to understand what is kicking around in a young person's head and proactively go back to them with feedback on it and conveying that I was thinking about this thing as well when you weren't in front of my face is one thing that kids told us they interpret as emotional caring. Second is challenging growth, and you can see that the core idea there is we're going to insist that you continuously try to improve. That involves inspiring kids, setting high expectations for them, stretching them to go beyond their current status, and creating limits when in fact those limits are appropriate. And the one-pager that you have has slightly longer descriptors of each of those examples. So one of the things I thought I would use for challenging growth, there was a blog that went kind of viral from a writer a number of months ago, and he happened to have been an adult, but it seemed that he captured how growth gets challenged in a developmental relationship so clearly, I thought I would use it anyway. He was trying to decide if he was going to ask his girlfriend to marry him. And essentially, according to the blog post, which some of you may have seen, he was on the verge of not doing it because there were all of the ways that was going to tie him down. And he said that to his father, who he writes in what the passage we'll take a look at now, had one of those moments where he challenged him to go beyond his current thinking in a way that changed his life forever. He said, perhaps each of us have moments in our lives when it feels like time slows down or the air becomes still and everything around us seems to draw in, marking that moment as one we will never forget. My dad giving his response to my concerns was such a moment for me. With a knowing smile, he said, Seth, you're being totally selfish. So I'm going to make this really simple. Marriage isn't for you. You don't marry to make yourself happy. You marry to make someone else happy. More than that, your marriage isn't for yourself. You're marrying for a family, not just for the in-laws and all of that nonsense, but for your future children. Who do you want to help you raise them? Who do you want to influence them? Marriage isn't for you. It's not about you. Marriage is about the person you married. Now, you may or may not agree with that. I'm not sure that I do. But this was a moment of decision for that person where, because of the power of the relationship he had with his dad, it had a decisive and positive impact for him. This may be kind of a bad analogy, but it's a little bit like when a running back sees a hole in the line in a football game and gets through it at that immediate moment. In a developmental relationship, you're taking advantage of those moments when an opportunity presents itself to connect in a way that has very positive, long-standing implications. I'm from Minnesota. I'm a Vikings fan. And unfortunately, last year we didn't have many of those moments, so I'm hoping in the future things will shift. So the third strategy is providing support. This is about saying you're going to help me complete tasks and really critical goals in my life. You can see that that touches on encouraging, guiding, modeling, and advocating for kids. I know I'm going through this very quickly to try and move us through. So this is an example of a teacher, also somebody who writes a blog, who's in his 30s, and here's what he wrote about his kindergarten teacher. Mrs. Martino, my kindergarten teacher, was one of the most important and influential people in my life besides my parents. She was the one who noticed I was an awkward and insecure boy and made sure to remind me daily of how talented and beautiful I was. My success in life is directly related to the confidence this incredible woman instilled upon me during my most important years. When you think about this, is someone in his 30s thinking about his kindergarten teacher and the impact that it had upon him as he felt encouraged by her validation of him. And we heard about this from the kids we interviewed and the focus groups we did again and again and again, that the experience of explicitly being seen and validated is tremendously important to young people. Sharing power, which may or may not be the term that we continue to stick with, because some of the individuals that we worked with and who responded to our surveys, I'll just say also, especially from groups that were new to the United States, didn't place the same importance on this that some others did. It may be an area where culture and life experience means relationships experienced differently, but this is one in which recognizing the young person's increasing autonomy, giving them voice, giving them a say in decisions was another fundamental part of a developmental relationship. So that has to do with respecting, giving voice to the kid, responding to their ideas, and collaborating. As the few times that we've been talking about this, I mentioned this is one of the first times we've walked people through this framework, that we've been talking about this. A lot of the folks that I've talked to have suggested this is an area that schools really need to work on. And it sounds like from the video, it's something that is actually happening pretty well here. But the opportunity to exercise control, to exercise agency, is another really important aspect of these developmental relationships. So actually, I thought I would give you a personal example of the balance in sharing power, because sharing power does not mean, of course, just letting the kids do whatever they want. So that actually is a picture of my family, and I got married that's my wife Katie, in 2012, and we blended families. So the kids, the tallest girl and that boy, and then the girl on the floor are my kids, Lauren and Adam and Victoria. Their mom, my first wife, died of breast cancer in 2006, and so I was a single parent for a number of years. And Thomas and Molly, the other two kids, are Katie's kids, and we've now merged this family. And one of the most interesting dynamics that we have is in my parenting with Adam and Lauren and Victoria, I have always emphasized, I'm realizing now maybe to a fault, sharing power. Now, they're not disrespectful kids, and so they don't say things that are inappropriate, but they always share their opinion. And they always want to discuss why I want them to do something, and whether they think there's a better way to do something. Katie, who's a middle school principal actually, so she's used to telling people where to go and what to do. She has parented, and with her ex-husband, much more with your kids do it this way. I have come to see, as we've been married for a year and a half, the merits of the way she's parented, and I think she's coming to see some of mine, because on one hand, I don't always need to hear what Victoria at age 10 thinks could be improved in the direction I'm giving her. But those 3 kids have got resilience coming out of their ears. They have ideas and agency. Thomas and Molly are actually kids, it's not to suggest they're docile, but they also just get stuff done faster. They move things forward faster. And yet, they also let life happen to them a bit more. And so we see this, and when there are plays in our co-parenting, it plays itself out all of the time, where she says, well, I know you think they should be allowed to express that, but so a little personal example of that. There's no one way to do it. There's no simple way. But out of the developmental relationships work, as we looked at the notion that the kids, especially as that they get older, are being given more authority in their lives, grew stronger and stronger. So finally, expanding possibilities. This was the last piece that came out of the framework. And this, we kept hearing about, well, my dad, my teacher, my coach, my mentor took me to this place, got me into this program, gave me this book. And expanding possibility was the final feature of these relationships that help kids develop a sense of who they are and a thriving mindset. And that involves exploration, helping them connect things in their lives to the world at large, and navigating. And I thought I'd give one example, and maybe some of you may have seen it, that was recently on the cover of the New York Times, and it's really a heart-wrenching story. There was a baby, less than 1 year old, and it was that young woman with the sweatshirt on, who was left in a home where there was a mass murder and 10 people were killed, but the baby was left alive. And a young police sergeant, who was that woman, came in and had to pick up the child from this horrific scene. And they didn't know who the next of kin were, and so she literally took her back to the precinct and had her for almost a week. And because they couldn't figure out. They eventually found her mother's mother, and she went to live with her, and her father, biological father, hadn't been involved. So after this initial brief bonding period, the police sergeant went back to her work, and this young girl was living with the grandmother. The grandmother struggled, as the story describes, with raising her, and so she reached out to the sergeant, who by this point was married to another police officer, and they started with just taking afternoons together on the weekend to bring her down to the precinct or take her to a museum in New York. And what became clear through the story is that from those outings, which were simply designed to expand this young girl's horizons, who didn't know until she was about 12 the horror of what had happened to her, slowly grew into a relationship that finally reached the point where the woman, who's now a captain in the New York City Police, adopted the woman at age 31. And when they interviewed her about the woman who had now become, very recently, her adoptive mother, she said this. The girl's name was Christina, and Joanne was her mom. "I can't imagine my life without her. She taught me what it was like to hope and to truly trust. If ever in life I didn't think things would work out, I could trust her, and I would just put all my trust in her, and she would get me through to the other side." The interesting thing about the decision to go forward with the adoption was the police captain struggled with it. I mean, should I adopt somebody who's in their 30s? Does this make sense? And her husband said to her, "You need to do this for you." And I think that highlights another part of a developmental relationship. Even though most of what I've talked about seems to go with the arrows from the adult to the kid, it's really a two-way street, and the adult is benefiting and growing from the relationship as well. Okay, so how should you think about developmental relationship in your kids' lives or in the lives of the kids you work with in a school or a program? And you have a version of this graphic that we handed out. If you think of it in this simple framework, that the kid is at the center, and then we've got the family, the school, the program. Some of the people this morning stressed, and they're absolutely right, it ought to say community beyond the program area, and it probably should have another 3 circles. But for the sake of clarity, let's say that we need to understand the contexts in which kids exist. And for those of you who've studied these things, this is an ecological view of kids' development. But take this simple graphic, which I did on the plane with not great graphic skills, so you really are getting an update on very current work. And let's divide it into the 5 quadrants of a developmental relationship. There's caring, there's challenging growth, there's providing support, there's expanding possibilities, and there's I even used the old term. That should be sharing power, but I used respect at that point. Now, in our early thinking, it's not that every relationship in a kid's life needs to do all of those things, all of the time, but that kids need to experience those 5 factors over the course of the multiple relationships in their lives. And some relationships are going to emphasize one more than the other. But that especially as parents, but also as adults who have unique roles with kids where we're trying to think about their whole development, what we need to have our eye on is that there's no pieces of the puzzle, there's no areas of the 5 categories where the kids are experiencing no relationships, and that there's no rings where the kids are experiencing no relationships. So that in school, in their families, in the youth programs they're in their communities, you want to have them experiencing some mix of these kinds of relationships. And you also want to make sure that they've got, that they're experiencing them. It doesn't have to be, they're experiencing them at the right moments. And there's no simple formula for this, so this is really just a simple way, hopefully, to try and think about it. In a perfect world, that's what it would look like. The kid is surrounded by this wonderful, nurturing, it takes a village, and you've got all of those factors coming together. In the real world, we know there's going to be some areas in which kids experience some relationships in certain ways much more strongly than in others. So what I'd like to do now is give you a oversimplified, quick vision of 3 kids that we actually interviewed in the course of coming up with this framework. And I want to stress oversimplified because, as you'll see, I've represented graphically what they told us in some ways that probably make the lines a little too cleanly drawn. But in the big picture, this is what we heard from 3 very different kids. So Janet, who is age 17, told us that she has a mom and a dad, and her mom and dad very clearly express care for her. She has no doubt that they love her. Her mom is dramatically more interested in her opinions and ideas than her dad. She had the sense that sharing power is not something that her dad places a tremendous priority on. That both of them expose her to a lot of opportunities, that she has chances to do activities and go places, and that she also feels very supported at home by her mom and dad. She felt like at school, there was also on the part of teachers and other staff a lot of caring that she received, and that she also felt very cared for emotionally by her friends as well, and also supported. There was one teacher in particular who actually liked to read, if I'm remembering right, her poetry, who she felt was particularly interested in exposing her to new ideas, and in sharing power in her thoughts and actions. And that she felt that her friends shared that as well. She was in a dance program, was a very big part of her life, and she felt that was an area where people cared about her a lot. So if you look at Janet's map, though, what we see, and we added, she felt that because she could help design choreography in her dance program, that was also an area where she got to exercise authority. And so there was a real sharing of power there. And she had been in a work experience program at one point, so that there was someone who had been a mentor to her that she felt was exposing her to some sense of new possibility. But when we pushed her and asked questions about how challenged she felt in school or in any of these other settings, she came back with the sense that she didn't really feel that anybody ever really pushed her very hard to reach beyond what she already was. And so the kind of oversimplified takeaway from that map of Janet's life relationally was that there was some thinking that could productively be done about the degree to which the relationships in her life were actually pushing her to go beyond where she already was. So we also interviewed April, who was age 10. These are not their real names, by the way. And she had a family. Oh, I should say, in making these graphs, the only people I had were the clip art that come with PowerPoint, so that's why there's all these crazy people. So this is not like a representation of what these people actually looked like. It's what I could find to put together to try and represent these ideas for you. So like you'll notice, unfortunately for April, everyone in her family's on the phone all the time. So that's kind of why I got that. So April said she family very, very strong in expressing care, and I think you get the idea here. So I'm gonna go through this really quite quickly. Felt that parents were very strong on academics, really expected her to do very well in school, were willing to provide any support that she needed academically. Felt that she went to a school where there were high expectations and she was really expected to do well. Described having one friend, so I had to find like one kid in the clip art on PowerPoint, one really good friend that she studied with all of the time, where she felt they pushed each other and they pulled each other to excel and do better. Interestingly, she said, everyone in my family is always telling me that I should be in different careers. So I tried to find as many careers in the clip art as I could. And so you could see we have doctors and business people. We have, I think, a plumber there. We have a soccer ball, a chef. We have someone who's a clip art person as their profession, sitting on a box or something. And we have that person there. Here you can see that the, again, oversimplified takeaway from April's life is that there's not a lot of sense that she has, maybe not entirely inappropriate for a 10-year-old, that people are wanting to share power and build her sense of autonomy or expressing care. Final point, final example, a boy, Carter, age 13, single mom, felt that his mom was very strong in wanting him to do well in school, wanted to challenge and support him whenever he could. His grandfather was the relationship that he felt did all of these things and was in many ways the closest relationship. I could only find a farmer with a hoe there. He lived in a city, not the countryside. The only relationship he talked about in school was a counselor. And he had one relationship with a counselor that he felt was a really, really strong, powerful relationship. He ran track and felt that his relationships in the programs in track were where he experienced the most emotional caring and challenge, and also a lot of support, and the chance to really exercise authority in that context as well. But it was in school where the only relationship we heard about was the one counselor. And so that's an area where relationally the question is, was Carter forming those kinds of close relationships in a school setting? So the question that you can tell that I've been driving toward for quite a while here is, could you draw this map for the young person in your life? Or if you are a young person, how would you draw it for yourself? And the exercise of trying to think about these things in our early work is a productive way to begin seeing your son or daughter or the kids in your class or program through the lens of relationships. Very quickly, one thing I want to emphasize, though, is that if you try and draw your kids' map, if you try and think about their relationships in their lives, it's really important to talk to the kid, because a lot of us assume we know how kids are viewing and experiencing the world, but there's other research we've done at Search Institute and elsewhere that really confirms that what we think is the case in the minds of young people may not always be the case. We went and we asked in a very large national study in 2012, how comfortable are you in talking about these subjects? And the parents' responses are in blue, and the kids' responses are in orange. And you can see that the parents thought that things were much more collaborative and safe to talk about than the young people did. So if you do decide after tonight to take that relationship map and do some thinking about how it might apply to your own life, make sure that you have a conversation with your son or daughter or others. By next year we'll have a survey that we hope can be multi-perspective. The kid can take it, the parents can take it, and caring adults in school or elsewhere can take it, and we can look at actually how all of them see their relationships. That just kind of proves the point that sometimes we think we're seeing something the same way, and we're positive we're speaking the same language, and then we discover that we're not. And so take some time to visit this question with the young people in your life where you're listening as opposed to telling them what you think is going on. So the question I really would want to hope that some of you will be interested in thinking about beyond this session is, as you think about the kids in your life, professionally or personally, where do new investments need to be made? Maybe support is coming very naturally to you, but challenge is something that needs some attention. Or one mom that came and talked about this framework with us at one of the focus groups, then sent an email subsequently and said, I put the early version of the framework on the refrigerator, and my 2 teenage daughters constantly tell me now that I never share power. And she actually said that, yeah, that's a little annoying, but they're actually right. That I wasn't soliciting their opinions on these kinds of things. Hopefully all of this paints a picture of the fact that a lot of us in education have been talking for the last 10 years or so about a new 3 R's: rigor, relevance, and relationships. If we challenge kids academically more, if we connect what they do in school to life after school, and if we build relationships with them, we'll have young people who are more successful in school and beyond. In my experience, we've done an awful lot with the first 2 R's, and the 3rd R is often kind of an afterthought. We almost assume sort of that if we get the rigor right, and if we try and point kids toward college and things like that, that then the relationships will happen as a result. And our work to date would suggest that, in fact, we need to be a lot more intentional about it. So I thought I would end with a quote from a book that some of you may remember, The Velveteen Rabbit. And it's a kid's story, and it's about a toy rabbit that wants to be real. And of course, becoming a real rabbit is a metaphor for growing up in the story. And in the book, the toy rabbit gets wisdom from a toy horse who's much older and has lived much longer. And I think in the end, what the toy horse is describing to the rabbit, the Velveteen Rabbit, is a developmental relationship in a young person's life. And I actually have the key passage from that book at the end on my phone here, and so let me end with that. It's toward the end of the book. And the skin horse, which is the name of the horse, says to the rabbit, "Real isn't how you are made. It's a thing that happens to you when a child loves you for a long, long time. Not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. "When you are real, you don't mind being hurt." "Does it happen all at once? Like being wound up," he asked, "or bit by bit?" "It doesn't happen all at once," said the skin horse. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily, or who have sharp edges, or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you're real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly except to people who don't understand." "I suppose you are real," said the rabbit, and then he wished he hadn't said that, for he thought that it might make the horse feel sensitive. But the skin horse only smiled. "The boy's uncle made me real," he said. "That was a great many years ago. But once you're real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always." That ultimately, by expressing care, by challenging growth, by providing support, by sharing power and expanding possibilities, we're helping kids become real. We're helping them develop a sense of identity and develop the kind of thriving mindset that's going to serve them and us well in the future. So that's an overview of where we are in this early research. Thank you for your patience in walking through that. I'm now going to turn it back to, I guess, the whatever time we have remaining for comments or questions.
Thank you so much for that very informative talk. I thought what was particularly helpful for me is that I feel like a lot of times when I go to talks like this, I hear a lot of what's what's important to do, but not necessarily specific strategies. So I really appreciate you sharing those specific strategies. And I think one of the things that really, really stood out for me is not only the impact that a mentoring relationship can have on kids, but the two-way that you mentioned, it's a two-way street with the adult growing and benefiting, and that really resonated with one of the things that one of the mentors said in the video was that it gets us out of our bubble as adults. And as somebody who works a lot with adolescents, I always worry that there is so much age segregation in our society that teenagers especially don't spend a lot of time with older people or younger kids. And so this is a chance for them to really be influenced, but also be able to influence the mentors and to really feel that purpose themselves. So thank you for a wonderful talk. And thank you to those of you who submitted questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as I can here. I'm going to start out with, again, as somebody who works with teenagers, I'm going to start out with the one that resonated with me the most, which is, my teen is so annoying right now that I can't imagine asking someone else to be in her village. And are there any suggestions? And I wanted to point out one of the quotes from the slides, which from the very beginning that mentioned the authority of a parent without the psychological baggage, and that's what a mentor can provide. And also to remind parents that what may be annoying to you may not be annoying to other adults, which is why a mentoring relationship is so important. So I will turn it over to the two of you to address any of the issues that came up with that question.
Yeah, my teen is so annoying that why would I inflict them on another relationship? That's a great quote. I think I'm going to really try and stick to what the last year and a half has told us, as opposed to like this is Kent's opinion on something. We heard from the kids again and again that they can be dramatically different in their interactions, one relationship to another. And so that the way that teen is interacting with you, as you picked out the quote, might in fact be dramatically different from the way they would interact with somebody else. Now that may be a difficult thing to accept as a parent, but if the issues that the teen is dealing with or the developmental stage that they're at are such that working with that other adult is going to open a new pathway, a new possibility, probably she shouldn't close it off because she might just be embarrassed. The other thing that we heard again and again from kids, and I should say a lot of my work has often focused, before coming to Search Institute, on young people who are struggling academically and facing challenges, but all of this included kids who are doing well in school and who are from moderate or even upper income families as well. So we're talking about kids across a diverse span of experience. What we heard from those kids was, often they didn't say it like this is not teenager language, I'm often testing the adult to see if they're going to give up. And that it's the 8th time, the 9th time, the 10th time that they just they don't stop hectoring me about doing my homework or doing that project, but they don't stop saying, I care about you and I want to connect. That this is an area where you can positively wear them down. And some of the teens actually were about as explicit as I was, like, I'm testing them. Now this was talking in particular about school and program contexts where they're used to people coming and going, but I think it's not entirely possible that there might be some of that happening with the parent as well. And one of the questions I would have too for that parent, how often are you doing some of these things here that we talked about that might open a new door in that parent's relationship with his or her daughter? Thoughts on that one? Okay.
And that actually reminded me of something that one of my mentors said to me when I first started to work with adolescents, and I don't think it only applies to adolescents, but that adolescents are like somebody buying a used car, and they will slam your doors and try to drive you as fast as you can, but if you keep running, then they will buy whatever you're selling. And again, I think that goes for anybody in any relationships where we're being tested. If we can hold our own, then you can just develop a deeper, further relationship. So the next question is, as a parent, how do you encourage or help your child to develop these relationships? And I'm going to add on a part of my own question to that is, what are some skills that parents can specifically teach their child to be able to reach out to and connect with other adults if they're seeking a mentoring relationship?
God, these are all discussion points more than they are like, here's an answer. In suggesting that you might want to, whether you use my silly graphic representation or not, I think it is a productive endeavor for the parent and for the young person to try and draw that map. Especially to engage the young person in thinking about how often do you feel challenged? How often do you feel supported? How often do you feel that your voice is heard? And especially if you engage that conversation at the right time and create safe space for honest feedback, you can get some really clear responses. Doing this work has dramatically changed the way I parent. My kids, and I have too many of them now, so I really needed it. And it hasn't been because we have got it packaged. Ultimately, we do want to have techniques like the work experience coordinator that I told you with the base touching, where she literally says, I sneak up on them and I say, I was thinking about you when you weren't with me. That's something I've started doing, actually. And now if it's phony and contrived, then it won't work, but it has to be authentic. But even if we don't have the 20 tricks for building a developmental relationships yet, I don't know if we ever will, simply looking at your relationship with your kids through these 5 lenses can, in my experience and the experience of other colleagues who have been doing this work with me, really change the way that you're thinking about how you interact with them. So those are some early first steps, I think, to thinking about ways that you could do it. I think when you ask the young person to describe where their relationships are, if there's gaps, if there's voids, I think it's a point of departure for a dialogue about how do we connect you to, for instance, other adults who are going to expand possibilities for you.
And I think that really resonates with the story about having to determine how to co-parent, that you're just getting information from a different point of view, and one is not 100% right and one is not 100% wrong, but it's really good to get input and to be challenged. So, Chris, what can you add from the teacher's perspective?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, one of the things that I find as the mentor coordinator here at Menlo-Atherton for my program is that students often find a hard time coming up with accomplishments that they've made throughout their life. And so the chart that you showed, like another thing that I find that's beneficial for the students as they move forward in life is parents often feel like the students know what their accomplishments are. And they haven't really, the student really, or the child hasn't had an opportunity to really understand that that was a major accomplishment in your life and you should be proud of that. And that really helps them build on like their future and what they want to accomplish.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, one of which is, I think this is a great idea, and I would love for my kids to expand their village and have mentors, but I'm very worried that my child will think this is a bad idea. So how can I talk to them or approach them and get them to think about mentoring in a positive light? And then kind of the flip side of that question is, my teen thinks that it's really weird that I talk to all of his friends, and he says, no other parent does this, just stay away. So what should I say in response to that? So you can answer either question or both together.
Well, this is an area where your expertise is probably way exceeds mine because you're right there, and it's been too long since I was directly in a context working with a lot of kids. I would say in terms of that question of how do I get my kid to be willing to try this, I understand that, and sort of relationships for relationships' sake often are not likely to get a teenager very excited. So connecting them to opportunities, to programs, to other experiences where relationships are going to be a really important aspect of it is one strategy. Well, that's easier said than done. How do you do that? Something that could be very productive that doesn't go as far as I'm going to add new adults to my teenager's life is engaging the other adults that are already in your teenager's life in this discussion. I've often found that parents who are dealing with something relationally with their kid don't raise that issue with the teacher, the counselor, the program leader, the coach, because it's seen as inside stuff. But the reality is those people already have relationships with the son or daughter. And so the notion that you actually engage them adult to adult in a dialogue about what you're seeing with the son and daughter is kind of another strategy that doesn't necessarily involve, we're going to go find new people to add to your existence. Because that can be, especially for some kids, something that just, life is so busy right now too, that the practical challenge of doing that is a big issue. So trying to engage the other adults that are already in your son or daughter's life in the kinds of actions that we've talked about today is a strategy worth pursuing. I know that with one of my kids, as I started to look at this framework, I very intentionally said to his teachers and coaches and others, Adam needs to be pushed. He's a kid for whom things come quickly, and if it's not easy, the tension starts to rise. And so a lot of them were backing off that. And I needed to say, no, he really needs to be pushed, not sort of 50 lashes and in an unsupportive way, but please, as a parent, help me do this.
And I would just add to that well, first of all, what teenager is not resistant to like new things like having a mentor or other adult in their life? But I find that just like if you have like another adult who can like contribute to that child's life, and they're going to be there for them whenever the student like wants or needs, then that's like a really unique relationship. And that's what I think you saw mostly in the video, is that it has nothing to do with age or expertise or like job function or future like endeavor. It has to do with like just that adult being there. And as far as adults getting involved in the teenager thinking it's weird, which I'm sure like I have a few students in my program whose parents are also directly involved, and I think that they've come full circle from oh gosh, please don't do this, to wow, like my friends think my mom or my dad is cool, and they're cool because they're there. They come all the time. They meet with the student and they work with them, and so the student really appreciates that.
Great, thank you. So I have quite a few questions from people who are wondering how some of the principles that you've talked to apply to kids that are experiencing some extreme situations, stressful situations, kids who are dealing with severe depression or who have had a recent traumatic loss, kids who are being bullied, or kids who have special needs, kids who are twice exceptional or have labels as learning disabled or other issues that they're dealing with that are in addition to some other things that other kids are dealing with.
That gives me a great opportunity to say something that I think is just, I said at the outset, but to really reinforce. This is work that is so much in progress and about which we have not even concluded our first study, that my answer to that question really is, I don't know yet. The framework that you see here is trying to begin building a common language for talking about relationships that's going to apply to lots of kids in lots of contexts. But there remains a very open question about how relevant this framework is, for instance, for a kid who's experienced trauma. These 5 meta factors emerged across a very diverse sample of kids, but you're raising a really fundamental issue. Like when a kid is in a high-stress situation, do their relational needs shift in fundamental ways? And there's a growing body of research on the impact of stress in young people's lives that we need to be very cautious about. And so it's kind of like this framework is attempting to give us a ground floor common language. And so asking and thinking about the role of relationships for young people in those situations is something that we hope we and others will be engaged in going forward. Mm-hmm. So I think the best I can say at this point is editorial comment? I think the best thing I can say at this point is that we did not come up with groups of kids for whom these factors do not hold true. And the quantitative analysis included lots of kids that would fit into the categories you mentioned, the survey data. But when you sit down with a kid in a school or a youth program or a community center for a focus group, you can't get the kind of information that we would need to understand that kind of angle. So it's just I really want to validate the question. It's a really important one for us to be thinking about and to be cautious about. One of the things that always happens in education and youth development is that, and I say this as a lifelong practitioner, when we get excited about an idea, we tend to oversell it. And so, oh, this relationship stuff seems to work for helping kids develop a thriving mindset. It probably works for helping kids resolve trauma. And because it helps to kids productively form a certain kind of mindset doesn't mean it necessarily is going to be the same framework that's going to be useful for kids in other settings. We need to ask that question.
Chris, do you have anything that you want to add about particular kids that you've worked with? No. So another question is, what if I don't feel very good about an adult in my teens village or a mentoring relationship, and how can I be sure that an adult is a good influence on my child?
You definitely should. You should definitely answer this one. I guess the only thing that the first thing that the work we've done to date brings to mind is really listen to the kid about why that kid is in that relationship with that adult. Because if you are just formulating a good-bad opinion of the adult, absent seeing that adult through the kid's eyes, you're going to miss the opportunity for insight. I mean, I know what that individual is saying, and I'm sure I might feel the same, but try and unpack why the young person is finding value in that relationship. That's something that the kids told us again and again and again. I'm not heard. I'm not heard. I'm not heard. So that's the first piece that would come out of it. How you actually handle that other adult relationship. I think the only other, and again, these are sort of blinding flashes of the obvious, so I stumble a bit as I say it, but it's often also the stuff we don't really make time to do. Engage the adult in a discussion in a respectful way that presumes they want the best for the kid. And if they don't, then as a parent, you have to take some significant action. But I think the conclusion of the work we've done to date would be don't rush to judgment.
Yeah, I mean, not rushing to judgment is like key. And in addition to that, just like really trying to, that's where I think as like a mentor in a relationship, you really have to decide what is the next step and how far do I want to like, how comfortable am I moving forward with the relationship? Because obviously engaging the parent is important, but that's a tough thing to do in that situation. And again, maybe like not jumping to conclusions and getting some feedback from other people who may be involved in that child's life can help steer you in the right direction.
And Chris, this is also, I think, a follow-up question for you is how receptive are parents of kids being mentored to inviting another adult's feedback into their lives? And do parents invite it? Do they feel threatened? Do they feel jealous? Are there any patterns that you tend to see?
Yeah, I've had experience with both, where parents are extremely like appreciative. In fact, like they have like the mentor over for like a family celebration, and they've just gotten really close, and that's special. But at the same time, yeah, there's definitely been student-mentor relationships where the mentor has wanted to expose them to like really like new and unique things in their lives. Something as simple as taking them to a museum or the opera or something, and the parents are not comfortable with that as much. And so that's where I think you just have to take those like small steps, make sure you have the opportunity to like introduce yourself and develop that relationship with the parent as well, to let them know that you're there to support the child and not become like their alternative parent.
I would say too that part of, again, we're in such the early stages of this work. Part of the goal would be to give that mentor, let's just say there is this mentor who wants to take the kid to X, whether it's museums or wherever. My guess is in most cases today that mentor would simply have to say, I'd like to take your son or daughter here, full stop. if they were able to say, exposing your son or daughter to these kinds of new experiences is something that we've seen can really benefit him or her in school and developmentally. It's not like they're going to say, Search Institute has this framework for developmental relationships, and it says I should take your kid to the museum. But it would be nice if they said that for us. But the notion of trying to find a plain language framework that we can use both with kids and as we seek to support kids to have that discussion between the mentor and the parent. So no, this is not me trying to, for instance, take your son or daughter out of your culture. This is expanding possibility, which we've seen has all these good benefits for his or her development and progress in school.
Great, thank you. So another question on there's a lot of terms that come out, especially if you are somebody who likes to keep up with a lot of the research, and sometimes it's hard to reconcile some of the terms. So we have a question about grit is a major term that's out there now. Angela Duckworth's work on grit, and then Denise Pope's organization, which is very active in this area, Challenge Success, talks about the problem with students being overstressed and therefore just doing school and not being engaged in school. And so the question is, does engagement need to be present for grit to develop? So for example, if kids are not engaged but can just get through school and get A's, is that developing grit? Is that perseverance? And how does that go in the framework that you've talked about today?
So, first of all, it's a fascinating question, and if whoever asked that question wants to talk further later about it, it'd be really interesting. But let me make this broad point. Much of the research that right now is generating a lot of attention, I think productively, because it's especially after a decade of No Child Left Behind where we really reduced kids to a standardized test score. And I lived that very directly, and there were some good things behind it, but ultimately some very destructive things that happen. So now you have this focus on growth mindset and grit and other things that are coming out often of these experiments, brilliant, clever experiments, that psychologists, many of which are in this community, devise in these novel settings to test kids eating marshmallows or not, or responding to the idea that the brain is like a muscle or not. What's, I think, a really interesting question is most of that research takes place outside the context of relationships. It's psychologists or even daycare providers, professionals, many of whom the kids don't know, performing the experiment with the kid. And that's really the only way in many cases to run these kinds of experiments. An important question, I think, though, is what happens with grit, with growth mindset, when it's experienced as part of an ongoing normal relationship. Now, that makes it hard as heck to study because you can't quantify that. You know, what a parent says to a kid in terms of praise or discipline for many months. But the question, I think, raises what I hope is one of the things we can explore through this research, which is how do regular relational interactions affect the kinds of attitudes and behaviors that are getting a lot of attention right now? It's an open question, I think. The interesting thing about the research on grit was that actually when Angela Duckworth started doing this, she was not studying regular kids and how do we make them grittier. She was studying West Point cadets and elite athletes and saying how do these people in fields where it takes 10 years to become expert have the fire in the belly to persist to that point. And she conceptualized it and measured it in very interesting and novel ways such that it's got everyone's attention. And I think a lot of people are now trying to take that research on high performers and, you know, apply it to some of the kids who used to be in my 11th grade social studies classroom, who frankly were kind of struggling just to stay engaged in the discussion. But of course it got so exciting that then they couldn't stand to not maybe. I think there's this real world of kids and relationship and the research world of experiments. And the challenge, and this is really where Search Institute wants to exist for the next 20 years, we hope, is bridging the gap. between the two to find out what happens with these things when regular everyday interaction starts to be intentional about something like challenging growth.
Chris, do you want to? I like that one. Do you want to add to that? Okay. So how can you determine, you had mentioned and showed the graph about being in that sweet spot of challenge and care. What are some things to pay attention to make sure that you're in that sweet spot? And I think alternatively, what are some signs that you maybe aren't in the sweet spot and you need to adjust your behavior?
You know, I think the biggest thing I would say, it's an awesome question, and 2 years from now, I would hope that we will be able, from the research, to give you a very vivid picture of what challenge means in practice and what care means. If you look on that page that we sent you out, though, the descriptors are really important. So a lot of times, the danger is that when we see the word challenge, we will interpret it as telling the kid to do something. And we'll interpret support as, do you need some help? Whereas, in fact, when we really talk to kids about these developmental relationships, things like challenge often took the form of just setting high expectations in the way the adult acts. And so it's really, the challenge is not explicit. This is how we act here, how we conduct ourselves. And the kid feels the need to rise to that bar. Similarly with support, oftentimes it was actually rolling up your hands and helping the kid do the activity, do the thing, as opposed to kind of the passive offering of support. And so I think the best I can do right now is to say, for both challenge and support, really look at the sub-points that are underneath those two big categories, because that's about as far as we've taken it right now with thinking through what that might look like in practice. Over time, we really want to be able to paint a picture of what productive challenge and productive support look like in a variety of contexts. But once again, asking the kid and being a genuinely good listener can tell you a ton. Because if the kid is feeling challenged but unsupported, or supported but inadequately challenged, the work we've done to date, which again is preliminary and we need to validate, would suggest kids know, and they'll tell you if you ask in the right way.
Chris?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to that is just on that final point, just that, and I think kids really want to tell. They want somebody to share stories with, and they might not always feel like the data showed that that you showed there that kids aren't always necessarily as comfortable as their parents think with them. And it's amazing, like when they get together with like kind of an adult who they don't feel like as, you know, there's just kind of there to support them, they're willing to share a lot of like, you know, insight, which then goes back to your other question about how comfortable are you in that relationship if something does come up that you are not maybe comfortable handling, what is the next step as like a mentor in that position?
I think, too, that question really underscores the importance of what I tried to make a not very funny joke about at the beginning, which is that I didn't talk tonight about peer-to-peer developmental relationships, and I joked about it because Barbara's been here, but really the importance of that point can't be underestimated. There are things that other kids can do productively with our kids that no adult can do as effectively. And that I think increasingly schools, youth programs, and even some parents are realizing I can come at this problem through other kids. And now how do we do that? Once again, it gets to the how-to question, but that shaping peer-to-peer relationships positively is a tool in the toolkit that a lot of adults have seemed to think that, well, that's not something I can do. I can't control how kids interact, but there are interesting examples of peer interventions, peer-based programs that can create a very positive climate among peers where it's not because the adults made me do it, it's because this is how we decided to act together as teenagers.
Great. Thank you for your answers to all, very thoughtful answers to all of those questions. I have a final card here that says, I have a question I'd like to ask in person. My name is Chris. I don't know, Chris, if you wanted to ask in front of everybody or you wanted to ask. Okay.
I was just struggling with how to write this, so here we go. I first learned about the Search Institute and developmental assets when I was a freshman in college in 2000, and I've been really involved and really supportive of the developmental asset model. So thank you for all your work, and this relationships is an important piece. Over the last 14 years, I have served many roles as a youth minister, as a school teacher, actually as elected official in my community. And one of the struggles that I have found is I'm a single male. I'm 33 right now. I was elected in 23 and very involved in other circles. And one of my struggles is community members that don't really they're struggling with the idea that's out there that we see in the newspaper all the time about adult males, single males. So I'm really struggling with how to really, develop these relationships, but at the same time also be cognizant of the, some of the larger issues. So I'm wondering if you've had any research or any, look into that of, how can, young adults that want to work, and I think, I may say so myself, I think it's an issue particularly to, young men and not necessarily women.
Yeah, thank you for raising that, because it can be a sensitive, really sensitive issue. So if I understand it right, if developmental relationships with non-parenting adults are a productive thing in kids' lives, and we want to see more of that looking something like what we've talked about tonight, so positive, good relationships, how do we deal with the fact that also there's a growing fear on the part of many parents, but also educators and others, of opening the door to those relationships because of perceived or actual impropriety? Is that right? So it's not something that we've looked at through this work yet at Search Institute, but I am on the board of Mentor, which is the national umbrella organization for mentoring. And what's really interesting is that there's a large movement in the mentoring world after 20 years of trying to basically define mentoring, and be interested in your perspective on this, define mentoring in very, very prescriptive ways. Mentors, high-quality mentors, which is how you get the good impact on kids, have these characteristics and do these things. And that's been a big movement for a lot of folks. But what they're realizing is that's a level of commitment that not every adult who would like to interact with kids is willing to engage in. This commitment, the formal mentoring, often comes with full background checks and some external supervision of the mentor-mentee relationship. Someone's checking in to make sure things are okay. And so to date, that has been the fix. It's not a simple fix, but that's been the fix. It's been formalizing the mentor-mentee relationship. But what's happening is people are realizing we've got this huge, what the organization calls mentoring gap. And you saw it in our data too. Half the kids basically saying, I don't have someone in my life besides my family. And this other evidence that suggests that if we did have caring adults in their lives, it would have good benefits. So that's leading to the emergence of what is right now going in this discussion by the name of informal mentoring, which is basically caring adults who are not necessarily in a formal program. And what that's doing is it's raising the issue that you're raising big time. Because suddenly I'm not going through a background check and becoming part of Big Brothers Big Sisters necessarily, but I do want to engage with kids in a less structured or formal way. So I think the best, at least I can say, and let's open discussion, see if there's other thoughts about it, is that the issue, you're not alone in raising the issue. That it's something that people are trying to think through. How do we do informal mentoring while putting in place safeguards for kids? And so that we don't keep someone like you, who could be a productive force in a young person's life, from doing that because you lack a way to figure it out with confidence. The work that we've done to date would suggest that engaging the parent is a first step. And saying, hey, I'd like to have this engagement through school or through a program, but I don't want to do it unless it makes sense for you as the parent. But I don't think that really resolves your question. It's a great one. Yep.
Yeah, I would just say as like with like just knowing a lot of the local programs, like mine and all the Sequoia and high school districts have like different levels of mentoring programs in addition to a number of the like organizations that I'm familiar with in the area, Boys and Girls Club and whatnot. I think there are different levels of like the type of mentoring that you can do. Some of my mentors, it's all supervised by me, and they meet with the student under my supervision at all times. That's the only time that they meet with the student. And again, I think it comes back to it may not be as like as deep a relationship as like some mentor-mentee relationships can take on, but the mentor's still there for them every time, and so I feel like it's a really positive experience for that child. If it goes to if it's a relationship which many of my mentors choose to take, where they are going to meet with them on a regular basis outside of school, unsupervised by me, or maybe even on campus, unsupervised, then they go through a background check, and it's really, I mean, it's not like a gatekeeper, but I do understand like the concern, and especially like having been a teacher at a really as a single male and at a young age. I do understand like that, that concern, both like for myself and like, for how it's going to be like, observed by the parents, the community. And so I guess that's just based on my experience. My next step would be, if you were interested in taking that relationship with to the next level, maybe start with a group or an organization where there's direct supervision, build that relationship with the student, and then see, about like introducing yourself to the parents and taking those next steps.
Great. Thank you to all of you for your questions, and thank you to both of you not only for being here and answering the questions so thoughtfully tonight, but also for the work that you do every single day for children and with children. So thank you.